Thomas Sowell wrote a book called Basic Economics. It's a very simple, easy to understand, non-biased book that doesn't bog the reader down with graphs and equations. And while it may be the inspiration for my YouTube channel, this channel is certainly not a regurgitation of what's in the book. I hope you just read it for yourself. My job here is to clear the fog on much talked about and often least understood economic topics. So with that being said, on to my first topic, debt. You may have heard a lot of terms about debt: national debt, public debt, budgetary deficit, or just deficit. These terms are not helpful to the casual observer and create a lot of confusion. Here's how it goes. The U.S. Congress submits a budget, and when it spends more money than it collects through various forms of taxation, it's called a budget deficit. If you look at the chart, you'll notice that in 2000 and 2001, the U.S. had a budget surplus. There was a lot of coverage of this in the media at the time. It's currently the source of a lot of confusion. I'm sure you've heard and read many people talk about or discuss Obama's budgetary deficit, and then mention, oh, well, Bill Clinton got us out of debt. I'm sure it can be done again. Now, I'm not here to judge the merits of Bill Clinton. While the U.S. did have a budgetary surplus for a couple of years, we also had a multi-trillion-dollar national debt. Okay, so what's the national debt? How is it different than a budget deficit? Well, when Congress has a budget deficit for a given year, it asks for additional funds. It gets so much from taxes, then it wants to spend a whole lot more than it collected in taxes, and it has to get that money somewhere. That missing money it collects from the Federal Reserve. Sometimes people just call it the Fed. The Fed then borrows money. It gets the money it needs, and the total of years and years of borrowing is the U.S. national debt. As you can see in the graph, the national debt continued to grow year after year during the Clinton administration as well. So just to recap, Congress passed a budget that created a multi-trillion-dollar budget deficit that will force the Fed to borrow that money Congress needs for 2009. And a few more trillion will be added to our already multi-trillion-dollar national debt. So this idea that the debt can be easily paid off is clearly a misconception that was largely inspired by a couple of years when we had a budget surplus. That's often being confused with our national debt. Two different things. The last graph I'm going to show you will put the size of our debt in perspective. Saying that the U.S. has a multi-trillion-dollar deficit in national debt doesn't really mean anything until you compare it to something relevant. First, let's start with a simple analogy. Let's say the U.S. has 3 million people who suffer regularly from headaches, and Canada has 30,000 headache sufferers. I won't insult you because of course you know the U.S. has over 300 million people and Canada has 30 million people. So by percentage of population and statistically, the odds of being a headache sufferer is the same in each country. Now those aren't the actual numbers, it's just to illustrate a point. So how do we put the national debt into some kind of perspective? Well, the best way to do it, and the most common way it's done, is to compare the national debt to the size of GDP. GDP is the gross national product. It's the basic measurement of the size of the economy. If you add up all the goods and services produced in the U.S., that's the GDP. So the last graph shows the percent of our national debt to GDP. Most responsible economists believe a healthy national debt level is somewhere between 30 and 70% of GDP. And when you reach 100% and over, you enter a danger zone. For example, in the European Union, they will not accept a new member state if their national debt is over 100% of GDP. As a side note, Italy, the world's 7th largest economy, and one of the founding members of the European Union, is at 103% of debt to GDP ratio. And if it gets much larger, they may even be asked to leave the EU. Now, the world's 2nd largest economy, Japan, has 170% of debt to GDP ratio. And yes, Japan has a very high standard of living, but it has suffered much economic stagnation, partly due to their crippling debt. In 2007, the US debt to GDP ratio was 60%, and we are rapidly approaching Japanese debt levels. I also want to express that debt isn't the end-all be-all indication of economic health. Yes, Zimbabwe has a terrible economy with a 241% debt to GDP ratio. And Botswana has a 5% debt to GDP ratio, and I wouldn't want their economic conditions either. Check out the CIA Factbook link on the sidebar if you want to see how other nations are doing with their debt to GDP ratio. In the next video, I'll be talking about the Federal Reserve. How does it borrow money? What role does it play in the economy? And what tools it has at its disposal. It has arguably the most powerful influence on the US economy and is very poorly understood. One last thing I'd like to leave you with on debt. I'm sure you have heard the argument that the national debt is a burden being left for our children, grandchildren, future generations to pay. And while that may be true, there's also a more pressing and immediate consequence of the ever-growing US national debt. As we have seen currently with the banking crisis, when banks stop loaning money, the economy comes to a grinding halt. Business needs to borrow money to grow new areas and create new jobs. Well, what's going to happen when our national debt consumes all loanable funds? If the world's money is going to finance public debt, there will be less and less money available to loan to business. This will increase the cost of capital. And very much like Japan, business growth and opportunity and job creation will come to a grinding halt. It's something to think about. So please share this video with your friends, keep comments topical, and hope to see you next time.